dream I know, deep up my feelings for you. Watch.
The headlines: Federal government plans 26 trillion borrowing, 29 trillion for debt servicing. Welcome to Reality Latest Gist, your home of news and politics. Thank you so much for joining us on today's news. If this is your first time of watching, do us a favor to subscribe and also the notification bell to get notified when next we drop our video, because I'm sure you don't want to miss out the trending and latest news happening on social media. You can send in your comments and keep the conversation lively on our comment section. To all our returning subscribers, thank you so much for staying tuned with us. We really do appreciate. To all our viewers out there, feel relaxed, enjoy and stay tuned. Now on the news. Nigeria's total public debt may hit 118.37 trillion in the next 3 years. The figure was based on analyzing Nigeria's current debt profile and the debt projection in the Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and Fiscal Strategy Paper 2024 to 2026. According to the new Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and Fiscal Strategy Paper, the federal government plans to take 26.42 trillion loans between 2024 and 2026. The fiscal policy also indicates that debt servicing will gulf 29.92 trillion in 3 years. The data shows that the national government plans to borrow 7.81 trillion in 2024, slightly less than the 8.84 trillion targeted for the same year in the previous Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and Fiscal Strategy Paper. A breakdown for 2024 shows that the federal government plans to get 6.04 trillion from domestic lenders and 1.77 trillion from foreign creditors. By 2025, the federal government plans to borrow 8.54 trillion, which also less than 10.62 trillion targeted for the same year in the previous Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and Fiscal Strategic Paper. A breakdown for 2025 shows that the federal government plans to get 6.42 trillion from domestic lender and 2.12 trillion from foreign creditors. The federal government plans to borrow 10.07 trillion for 2026, which consists of 8.94 trillion domestic loan and 1.13 trillion external debt. Based on our analysis, the federal government is reducing its appetite for foreign loans to focus more on borrowing from domestic lenders. It was also found that the country had borrowed about 5.05 trillion between January and June from its 9.62 trillion borrowing plan for 2023, which means that the federal government will likely still borrow at least 4.57 trillion more this year. The Debt Management Office recently said Nigeria's total public debt hit 87.38 trillion at the end of the second quarter. The figure represents an increase of 75.29% of 37.53 trillion compared to 49.85 trillion recorded at the end of March 2023. The increase was primarily due to the 22.7 trillion ways and means advances of the Central Bank of Nigeria to federal government and the naira devaluation that added about 13.38 trillion to the external debt figure. With an 87.38 trillion debt as of June 2023, the likelihood of 4.57 trillion new debt before the end of this year and a plan to borrow 26.42 trillion in 3 years, Nigeria's total public debt is expected to hit and even exceed, due to the subnational borrowing, 118.37 trillion by the end of 2026. Despite the rising debt, the federal government has insisted that it will stick to its borrowing plan. Over the years, Nigeria's low revenue generation has pushed the government to borrow more. However, President Bola Tinubu recently expressed his administration's commitment to break the cycle of over-reliance on borrowing for public spending and the resultant burden of debt servicing its place on the management of limited government revenues. President Bola Tinubu recently said that the country could not continue to service its debts with 90% of its revenue. He noted that the country was heading for destruction if that continued. In quotes, the president said, "Can we continue to service external debt with 90% of our revenue?" It is a path to destruction. It is not sustainable. We must make the very difficult changes necessary for our country to get up from slumber and be respected among the world's great nations. To make a great nation, we must make bold decisions, even though it may be painful. It is not about you and me, it's about generation yet unborn. Recently, the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister for the Economy, Wale Edu, while unveiling an 8-point agenda for the economy, he said the government is not in position to borrow if you consider 90% debt service to revenue, and behind that, a rising debt to gross domestic product ratio. If you look at the last budget, you will see a borrowing requirement built into it and appropriated by the National Assembly, and that is ongoing. For data servicing, the rising debt has led to an increasing cost of debt servicing over the years for the federal government. The World Bank recently projected that debt servicing would gulf 123.4% of the federal government's revenue in 2023. The federal government has already spent 75.92% of its aggregate revenue on debt servicing between January and July 2023. The medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategic paper showed that the federal government had an aggregate revenue of 5.19 trillion in the first 7 months of 2023, but spent 3.94 trillion on debt servicing within the same period. The document added the aggregate expenditure for fiscal year 2023 is estimated at 21.83 trillion with a pro rata spending target of 12.29 trillion at the end of July. The actual spending was 8.60 trillion. Of this same amount, 3.94 trillion was for debt service and 2.68 trillion for personal costs, including pensions. Only about 857.08 billion, that is 25% of the pro rata budget, has been released for ministries, departments, and agencies. Capital expenditure as of July 2023. The debt servicing cost breakdown shows that the federal government spent 1.71 trillion on domestic debt, 530.48 billion on external debt, and 1.7 trillion on interest on ways and means advances. It was observed that the federal government spent 109.99 billion more than its debt servicing budget of 3.83 trillion for the period under review. An analysis shows that debt servicing will go for about 29.92 trillion in 3 years. The medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper 2024 to 2026 shows that the federal government debt servicing bill will cost 8.25 trillion in 2024. 10.06 trillion in 2025 and 11.61 trillion in 2026. For cash expenditure, it was observed that the total debt servicing cost would exceed what the country plans to spend as capital expenditure in 3 years by 8.41 trillion. The federal government has a total projection of 21.51 trillion for aggregate capital expenditure, which consists of 6.87 trillion in 2024, 7.31 trillion in 2025, and 7.33 trillion in 2026. The previous administration had claimed that the federal government had to borrow to finance infrastructure. However, despite the huge infrastructure deficits in the country, the federal government has continued to spend more on debt service than capital expenditure. The medium-term expenditure framework and fiscal strategy paper 2024 to 2026 shows that only 857.08 billion was spent on capital expenditure between January and July 2023, while debt servicing gulf 3.94 trillion within the same period. The World Bank recently described Nigeria's infrastructure level and quality as low, despite the federal government claim to have borrowed to finance infrastructure. In its Nigeria Public Finance Review report, the World Bank said Nigeria's physical infrastructure gap would likely reach $3 trillion in the next 30 years. Honestly, this country needs a thorough review of current loans and how they had been utilized to ensure economic growth. The governments have not shown enough discipline on how those money that they borrowed have been deployed. Honestly, it's not advisable to seek new loans So guys, let me know what you think about this in the comment section. I would like to know your thoughts, contributions, opinion are in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed to our YouTube page yet, please do us a favor to subscribe and also to notification bell to get notified when next we drop our video, because I'm sure you don't want to miss out on our trending and latest gist happening on social media. Once again, thank you all so much for staying tuned with us. We really do appreciate. On this note, we have come to the end of today's segment. Like, come your way next. See you guys. Bye.